My name is Monk Groh, and we're filming in New York City for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. I'm pleased to have my old friend, Onaje Allen Gums, with me today, and who's a marvelous piano player and arranger and composer, and manages to make a life in music in New York City, which I think is saying something.
Yes, yeah. That's kind of a mouthful. It's not the easiest thing to do, but one thing I learned early on, even as a teenager, was the ability to enjoy all genres of music. So jazz has always been my foundation. As a matter of fact, my first real introduction to jazz was watching TV and looking at Peter Gunn and Mr. Lucky, which was scored by Henry Mancini. So, needless to say, Henry Mancini had an integral part in my development as a musician and a music lover. And I used to go to every film he scored. And sometimes the films were horrible. But I just had to go because I absorbed his music so much. I became kind of an expert on his musical style and his way with horns and how he used it dramatically in film. And from there, I started listening to him on the radio, and from there I was introduced to Billy Taylor because he was a DJ on a local radio station. And he was on NEW, a station called WNEW. Then he moved to a station called LIB, which is still happening right now, but it's all R&B. But they had like a whole jazz thing.
Yeah.
So by listening to Billy and his roster of music and the other two DJs that were on that same station, I got introduced to Dizzy and Gil Evans and Miles, and this is like in the 60s, all these wonderful musicians. And I used to make a list. Now, mind you, I'm all of like 9, 10, 11 years old, all right? And I'm making a list of all these songs I heard on the radio that I liked. Like, I got to get that one, I got to get that one. And my sister also had a impact on me because she had a very eclectic taste as a teenager. I mean, most teenagers now would have one style of music in their repertoire. And at this time, like at 16 years old, she had Barbra Streisand and Johnny Mathis, Igor Stravinsky, Sonny Rollins, Lorez Alexandria, Johnny Pacheco. It was just endless of all these different Nat King Cole, Nina Simone. So I would go down to the basement where all the music was and just listen to everything she had. And it just broadened my horizon of realizing that I'd like to be a part of all this kind of music. So to shuttle between different styles of music was not a big thing for me. Through high school, I was playing with a Latin jazz band that was structured after Cal Tjader. The leader was a vibraphone player. The percussionist was Jerry Gonzalez of Fort Apache fame. And his brother, Andy Gonzalez. It was at Music and Art High School in New York. And so I was at that band. At the same time, I was working with one of my first mentors named Leroy Kirkland, who wrote Cloudburst. I don't know if you know that too.
Sure.
Yeah, he wrote Cloudburst. And he was also the arranger of a famous R&B tune called Our Day Will Come, Ruby and the Romantics. So I became kind of his protege, because his son felt I should meet his father. And he lived right down the block from the school. So a lot of times instead of going home, I'd go to his house. And he'd have me rehearsing with some of the singers that would come by the crib, and he took me to sessions. I met Kenny Burrell through him. I met Jerome Richardson through him because he was doing a lot of studio work. So all these guys in the studio. So I was in this whole world of these big guys, So again, with the big band, big band also, the Latin jazz band, doing duos, four-hand piano with another keyboard player in school, doing the R&B thing, it just again contributed to his whole eclectic approach and love for all styles of music.
Let me take you back for a minute. What led you to the piano, and was your family supportive of your music?
I just recently got a story from my mother. She said when I was in my crib, it's funny. She said when I was in my crib, you know, the bar, the thing in the crib, I'd be going like this.
Oh, come on.
She swears I was doing like this when I was a baby in the crib, just going like this. So she realized I had some musical talent. And I remember when I was 3 years old, I remember, when I was 3 years old, I would walk around the room singing Oh My Papa by Eddie Fisher.
Eddie Fisher.
Yeah, somehow I knew every word to that tune at 3. 3 years old. Now, a 3-year-old walking. You can imagine a 3-year-old singing an Italian song in Harlem. You know, it's you know. So anyway, we moved from Harlem. This was like '57. We moved from Harlem to Queens, and it's funny because I felt like at 7 years old I picked a house, and it turned out that there was a piano teacher right in the neighborhood that I could walk to her house from my house. Didn't know this. And the church she was the organist was right down the block also. Everything walking distance. So we went to her house and I began piano lessons. And she also was very instrumental in me developing my composing talents. Because Christmas time, we'd have to prepare a concert for our families, because you know if they could have a big Christmas dinner, and after everyone's filled their face, they'll come and hear little Alan play a little concert, right? So she helped all her students prepare these concerts, and with that she would have five Christmas cards on the piano. So she would say, she'd say, well, pick one as you like. So I picked one I thought was nice. I'd open it, and she said, okay, I want you to set this poem to music.
Wow.
And that's how I started getting into composition. And along with my love for Henry Mancini, my composing talent started to develop. I never really studied formally composition. By the time I took any composition courses, I took an elective in high school and one in college, I'd already been doing it. And one thing about my composition technique, I never could follow strict forms. In other words, like following the sonata form or whatever. And I remember in high school, my composition teacher in high school told me I would never become a good composer because I didn't follow the method to the T. Needless to say, when I got to Fredonia and I entered a contest where I had written a woodwind quartet piece that you played on. Did you play on it?
I don't think I played on it. I remember listening to it.
Yeah, the woodwind quartet piece. I took first place. What was very interesting is that one of the professors, Dr. Shield.
Yeah, Richard Shield, yeah.
Yeah, he came to the lunchroom and said, Alan won the contest, and it wasn't even jazz. You know, which was interesting because in going to Fredonia, that was kind of a culture shock.
I was going to ask how you ended up there. Was it?
Okay, what happened is that I had taken auditions for different schools. I tried Eastman, which I totally messed up. And Manhattan School of Music, for some reason, I took the theory to be a theory major. And a student named David Butler had come down to Music and Art and had talked up Fredonia. So there were about 6 of us from Music and Art decided we'd, look it up, see what's up. So I had gotten my teacher, because she never was really hot on like Bach And somehow I felt I needed to learn this composer for some reason. I said, I'd like to learn some Bach. And so we got into the, inventions first and then the fugues. So here I am at the audition for Fredonia, and I kind of aced everything, right? And see, Bach, although I wanted to do it, I wasn't really comfortable with Bach, So I played everything thinking that'd be it. And all of a sudden he says, well, do you know any Bach? Why'd he ask me that question, Well, I said, okay, I'll do my C minor fugue. And I just breezed through it.
Yeah.
Now what happened at that point, he started telling me about the school. Now I had already failed Eastman. I wasn't too happy about New York College of Music and Manhattan School of Music because I felt I'd see myself at the clubs all night with a midterm the next day because I'd probably be at the clubs watching Milt Jackson or Herbie,
right.
Instead of studying for an exam. So I said, I need to get out of New York. So I finished the audition, and he says, well, Alan, there aren't many black people in Fredonia. My thing was, I really don't care. I want to know, did I pass the audition or not?
I'm surprised he said that.
He said that. I never forget, because he felt it would make a difference. Because here I'm in the big city of New York.
Yeah.
And I'm going to essentially a country town.
Yeah.
I never forget, because downtown Fredonia reminded me of a scene from In the Heat of the Night. The opening scene of In the Heat of the Night, the downtown, if you ever see it, it looks like downtown Fredonia. Okay, so anyway, but at that point, that was the farthest from my mind. So I decided to say, listen, did I make it? I don't care about, And he said yes. So I was happy. And of course, the other 5 students also came to Fredonia. So I felt good because the culture shock wasn't that great. Because actually my first roommate was Warren Hargett, who was from Music and Arts. So it was really cool. And he ended up being one of my last roommates. Well, when we shared,
house.
Everybody, we shared a big house together. So anyway, it was cool, but there was still this thing because, I was drafted into the big band. Usually every situation you have to audition, you have to go through a whole process. And I have to admit, it was very weird because I was called to the rehearsal and they said, well, sit down at the piano and start playing. And I said, it's like, well, you got the gig. I said, excuse me? I just got here. It was like, not to make it seem too, I don't know how to put it, but it was almost like a situation where, okay, you're black, you're from New York, you play jazz.
Yeah.
We need a piano player.
But stereotypical.
It was it's like a stereotype. I don't want to go there, but it seemed like that's exactly what was happening. And I was already talked up before I got there.
Oh.
So they said, so I said, wait a minute, I just got here and I'm not sure. It's okay, you'll be fine, Needless to say, I was in the band. Again, the only black musician in the whole band. Through that, we did a festival at Villanova. And it was televised on PBS. And Gary McFarland watched it and wrote me a letter.
No kidding.
And what happened, at that time we still had a faculty instructor. So in his infinite wisdom, not realizing he had broken all the laws of the Postal Service, Gary mailed me a letter, right? And it says attention. If you get a letter that says attention, so-and-so, that is the person who's supposed to open that letter. And what happened is that the director, his name was Steve Wilazinski.
Sure, I remember him.
He had introduced me on the air as the piano player from the Queens. See, there's only one borough that says the before it, that's the Bronx. But every other borough is like Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Staten Island. but you get to Bronx, you have the Bronx.
I see.
So he said the Queens. So Gary thought that was real funny because he said, attention, piano player from the Queens. Well, it came to the jazz department.
Oh, he didn't know your name.
Yeah, he didn't know my name
I see.
because Steve
they
went by.
announced your name.
Yeah, announced it or it just went by
Okay.
real fast.
Right.
Because we did a composition that I'd written
I see.
that I had never done arranging before either.
Yeah.
So they helped me orchestrate this tune, and we did it. And so he opened the letter. Not only did he open the letter, he Xeroxed the letter and put the letter on the bulletin board.
Oh.
So everybody could read this letter that was mailed to me. I'm in theory class and say, Alan, man, there's a guy named, there was Joe Pisano, I think his name was. Man, there's a letter for you on the bulletin board. So what? I go downstairs, here's this letter from Barry McFarland. Now, mind you, I was excited, but I didn't realize the fact this man had broken all the laws and actually invaded my privacy because the letter was addressed to me.
Yeah.
And I met Gary McFarland, later on went down to New York. And he had a record label called Sky Records. He, Cal Jader, and Gabor Szabo. Unfortunately, all three of them had passed away.
Yeah.
But, so even during school, I was starting to get a taste of the professional world.
Neat.
And that kind of culminated with being connected with another person who's been a mentor to me, Billy Taylor. And I guess prior to that, Herbie Hancock. Because I met Herbie when an advertising firm came to give a lecture at a job at an ad agency, and one of the people working there was a friend of my sister. So they thought I might like to attend this seminar about music in commercials. And they had shown a commercial, a cigarette commercial. And actually, this little trivia is The Prisoner by Herbie Hancock.
Oh, yeah.
The tune I Have a Dream was originally a cigarette commercial.
Oh, wow.
Tune. Originally it was a cigarette commercial. And it was great. I mean, the tune is awesome, but that's where it started. That's where the gem started.
Yeah.
But I went and met one of the people who were doing the lecture. Had a meeting with him, and he thought I should meet Herbie. So I went to a concert that Herbie was doing in Central Park and introduced myself to him. And we started to hang out. I started to go to his house and everything. I was like, wow, Herbie Hancock. Now, mind you, he's only like all of 20-something years old, but to me, he was like
Right.
this legend, or
Right.
he's still in his 20s, you know. But I got to know him, and really, it was an incredible situation. But while I was in college, Billy Taylor, Dr. Billy Taylor, afforded me the opportunity to compose and arrange some music for a show he was music director of at that time. That was David Frost. And I'd gone to him and said, I'd like to write something for the show. And he said, well, I'll come back in August. So I thought it was like a W.C. Fields line. I'm like, go back, kid. Go away, kid. You bother me, yo. So I came back. He said, well, how soon can you write something? And I was like, oh, damn. He really wants me to do it. So I wrote this arrangement, composed, arranged. They copied it out professionally and everything. And I go back to school, and this is about the time we were at the house, the senior year.
Right.
I turn on David Frost every day. Didn't hear my song. So, man, they don't like my music. Wow. So, anyway, next recess, I go down to the studio and said, man, what happened? Well, Al, we had a little problem with your chart. So when I looked at the chart, I don't know what I was thinking. First page, the trumpet part is on line 3. The next page is on line 4.
Oh.
It's like, oh, we have a little problem, you know, over here. So we spent the time rehearsing and getting all the music together. We got it together. That day, for every cue going into a commercial, they played my song.
Oh.
I was like, wow, that was great. Plus, I was getting paid, you know.
Yeah. Did you have, when you graduated, most of us at the time, with a few exceptions, you know, everybody was going to go out and find teaching jobs.
Right.
But that wasn't your intention, was it?
No, what happened is that my father, who wanted me to do this, called me into the dining room, sat me down. So, okay, what are you going to do with your life? You know.
What are those questions?
One of them questions, you know, because here my mother, my father said, oh, good, he has a teaching degree, he'll have something to fall back on, and that kind of.
Sure.
And a few times before that, he called me in, and I really didn't know. I said, I'm not quite sure yet. Finally, this last time he called me in, I said, I want to be a working musician. And I know how hard it's going to be. I know it's going to be tough. But that's what I want to do. I'm ready to deal with it. Little did I know, you know what I'm saying, that all these words were true. But the thing is that when I said that, because my father was the kind of person that he may not agree with your decision, but if you were sincere and convinced and determined to do something that he knew was at least going to try to bring some value, he would support it.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happened is that, of course, during the time that we were graduating from Fredonia was in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And they had a lottery system.
I remember that. Do you remember standing in front of the TV and watching that thing come up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my number was 49.
Oh.
My number was up. So I was going to Vietnam. And I went through the whole thing of going down and the whole draft thing and taking the test, and couldn't bring myself to lie or do stuff that would
Yeah, right.
And of course, you know, I was the ready to ship me off. But I decided I wasn't going. And I wasn't going to flee to Canada. So the only thing I had at my disposal was to plead a conscientious objector. And I used my music as my religion, because there was religious reasons. And I went through different anecdotes, going back to in high school, when I was with Jerry Gonzalez, that Latin band, there was always fights. And I never get in the middle of it, because I valued their friendship. So it was always hard for me to draw sides and take sides, you know. And I just did this whole paper, like almost like a thesis, you know, about my feelings about war and feelings about killing people. And I had to have some people to write affidavits to support my feelings. And Dr. Billy Taylor was one of the people that wrote a letter. And at that time, I didn't realize, I found it maybe 10 years ago. My mother had a trunk with some of my stuff in it. And actually, he is the reason I chose the name Onaje, because I found the name in the book of African names. It says the sensitive one. Mm-hmm. And Billy wrote in print that Alan's a very sensitive person. And he wanted to say he will be of no use to you. You know, in other words, I guess his thing was, he'll sabotage your mission, because the man is so against killing people that you'll have a hard time.
Yeah.
So you really don't want him. So he did it like a roundabout way of telling him, you know, you don't want to sabotage your mission. So if you want to sabotage your mission, you will not take him into the army.
Yeah.
Then it turned out that one of the, where I was in a band at that time, another band in Queens, and one of the managers was actually on the board, what's it called? The draft board.
Yeah.
Draft board. And I did it fair and square. I mean, I went up there. My father went with me. He's a World War II vet, the whole 9 yards. But he supported the fact that I didn't want to go. and why I didn't want to go. And he stood by me. And at one point they asked me, if someone harmed your mother, would you retaliate? And I broke down and started crying. And I said no. And I remember I just couldn't contain myself. I just started crying. Because even though I knew that my manager was on the draft board, and not on that particular one, but he was part of the whole draft board process, I still wanted not to be like a shoe-in type of thing where I wanted to know that I was sincere.
Right.
So the only difference was the fact that instead of waiting 2 weeks, I found out that night that I got it. Okay. So I was, given the 4F classification. No, actually getting 4F classification. And I'm waiting to find out what this manager's going to do to keep me out of going. Now that I got this deferment. Because usually you have to go work someplace that's so far away from your house, you really wish you had gone in the Army,
Oh.
And that's why they make it very uncomfortable for you. Usually working like a mental institution or something like that.
Right.
So around that time, a friend of mine named Sabu, a great bass player, Sabu Adeola, who lived in Buffalo, who I met in my senior year at Fredonia, because one of the fellow students took me to Buffalo. I had never been to Buffalo.
Really,
The
all
whole
that time?
I would pass through Buffalo, but I never stayed in Buffalo. So I met some musicians during that time. And he called me and said, we have a program we'd like you to teach. It's a Model Cities program. And it turned out that this program fit the requirements of a CO deferment, because it had to be a nonprofit organization more than 50 miles away from your home base.
Oh.
Voila.
Yeah.
So I started working right away. I didn't wait for them to assign me. I just started working. And they wrote, the person who was in charge, Sabu, signed a form. I had to send away to show what I was making and all the kind of stuff. So about 6 months later, I get reclassified. So I'm relieved of my CO classification. But it should know is you'll never be called. You don't have to serve this anymore, and don't worry about being called. But since I was working up there in Buffalo and getting paid and going through all this whole thing, and with the music and the culture and everything, I decided to stay. I could have left right then, but I decided to stay in Buffalo. And I stayed there almost 2 years, where I also met my wife. And the benefit of that is that there was a club called the Revelot, and all the cats came through. All the cats came through. Herbie and Ahmad Jamal, Rahsaan Roland Kirk, Freddie Hubbard, Roy Ayers, George Benson, endless stream of musicians, Pharoah Sanders. And again, that was where Buffalo was, again, a definite nourishing environment for me to develop some things I hadn't done before, like my arranging. And it afforded me the opportunity of meeting some of these great musicians on a one-on-one basis. Because the thing with the Revelot was that most clubs, if you do a week, it's 6 days. But you start on Tuesday, work to Sunday. Revelot had a very interesting policy. You started on Monday, and you're off on Wednesday. And then you do a matinee on the following Sunday. So, and at the matinee, you can come and sit in with the artist.
I
So you
see.
can sit with Herbie Hancock, sitting with Rahsaan Roland Kirk, Freddie Hubbard, whatever. So that was pretty cool. So I had sown the seeds for the future by meeting all these cats I was able to talk to and get to know that I wouldn't be doing in New York, And it was something that was really great. And one of the people, again, who was a mentor of sorts, was Norman Connors, because he came through with Pharoah week right behind Herbie and his group, and commissioned me to do the title track of his second album, because I just approached him and said, I can be the guy you want, because he was looking for a certain type of arranger who could do strings and do tune in Brazilian flavor. He just like hit two buttons with that, because I was doing strings in college and Brazilian music was like my favorite. So from there, he listened to again my tapes from college, and I got the gig. You know, so that was my first major recording situation. And from there, I went to work with him about 6 months. You know, so I've done about maybe 5 or 6 albums, and most notably was my arrangement of Betcha Bagali Wow for Phyllis Hyman, which launched her career.
Yeah.
You know, and I went on to be her musical director, and recorded one more time with her. Well, actually, we did a whole album, the beginning of her career, and then 2 years later, I did one song called "The Answer Is You." And again, this whole eclectic thing was happening. I was still going between straight ahead cats and R&B cats, and so there's one thing that I really feel is important in the music is that we get further away from being so concerned about what it is and start being concerned about what it does. You see, because music evokes an emotional response. Our emotional responses, although at varying degrees, from being very subtle to almost like crazy, but still the emotional responses are pretty much the same, whether it's adulation or whether it's like joy or sadness, a tear, jumping up crazy, whatever, big smile on your face, whatever. It's the fact that whether Samuel Barber Adagio for strings, or John Coltrane doing Green Sleeves, or Duke Ellington doing Satin Doll, or Aretha Franklin doing A Natural Woman, you know, or Al Green doing Let's Stay Together, okay, or Jimi Hendrix doing Hey Joe. The emotional response is still the same. You know, and we spent so much time separating the music. I think jazz is the music that is the foundation for everything, to me. Because I feel that a jazz musician has instinctively more eclectic tastes than a rock musician or a classical musician or a country western musician. Most of the composers in the 60s for Universal Studios, especially, were primarily jazz musicians. Benny Golson, Benny Carter, Quincy Jones, Oliver Nelson, Lila Schiffer, Neil Hefti, Gil Malay, Henry Mancini, Nelson Riddle, Marty Page, all jazz musicians. We didn't see Aaron Copland in there.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we didn't see Earl and Scruggs, you know, Earl Scruggs, whatever. You know, we didn't see, but we heard classical music. We heard jazz, we heard rock.
They could write anything.
They could write anything, you see. So I felt good about that. I was part of that community that had those kind of, again, those eclectic tastes.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to continue that. I was my big idol when I was a teenager was Herbie, because again, the fact that he was with Miles, and then doing all these like CTI A&M dates with Wes Montgomery and people like that, and Paul Desmond. I said, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. He's playing all this hip stuff over here, and then working with Miles, you know, and then doing his own albums. You know, that's what I wanted to do. But I also had made a decision. I wanted to be a producer. I wanted to be a songwriter. I wanted to be a pianist. Okay, I wanted to be an arranger. Okay, and I haven't done a whole host of things as compared to maybe somebody like Randy Brecker, okay, or Herbie. But the body of work that I've done, I really feel proud of. The fact that it's been recognized and it stood the test of time. But moving ahead again, after college, the whole thing, now moving to the Nat, because that's when I really got to know them. Nat had formed a band. And I was asked by a very good friend, drummer Buddy Williams, to come into the band. And I also had met a bass player whose last name was the same as mine, Gums, Fernando. So I called him to audition on bass. So he got the gig, so we both in the band. And I stayed in the band for about maybe about a year. But what I learned with Nat was the importance of engaging the audience, which his brother was a master of doing. And it was so incredible to see how he was able to have the audience in the palm of his hand. And it stayed with me as it has stayed with people like George Duke, who went through Cannonball's band.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we were in there for a while, and then we broke up because he was giving us a lot of responsibility as a band. We were called the Basic. We were so Nat Adderley and the Basic Black Band. You know, because Nat didn't feel like doing all the road work.
Oh.
All those little stuff, like the renting of the truck and all this kind of stuff. So he put that in our laps. But we got tired of it after a while. So that's when he disbanded the band, realizing he had to come back on board and take charge. Because we liked it for a while, and then we got kind of tired of it. So we said, Nat, listen, can we ever talk? You know, so we had a band meeting, you know. And that's when he decided, I'm going to dismantle, this band. But I was in a club, and Woody Shaw was in the club. He had a way of talking. He had this gruff little voice. And he says, you want to join my band? What? You want to join my band? I loved him as a player because he was one of the baddest cats. But I wasn't too crazy about him, I wasn't sure if I wanted to work with him, So I said, well, who else is in the band, Let me, So he said, well, Victor Lewis is on drums and Carter Jefferson's on tenor and Clint Houston. Cool, yeah, okay. Because I love those guys, so if nothing else, I'll have some great cats to work with if I can't even stand Woody,
Yeah.
But it turned out to be one of the most incredible experiences. And Woody had said in print, as the years progressed, only maybe 2 years, during that time, Woody had done an interview. And comments came about the members of the band. And it got to me. And he said, Onaje is to me as Gil Evans is to Miles. I said, oh, okay. I still have to find that article because I lost it somewhere. It's a downbeat. I'm sure they can have microfilm, whatever.
Yeah.
But the other thing that really blew my mind is when he got the deal with Columbia Records. And he was going to do an album called Rosewood. And he said, Onaje, I want you to arrange this tune. Just do it. So, okay. So I took it upon myself to arrange a tune, no running interference. I didn't have to show him what I did to get his approval. I just did the tune. And it was like the title track of his first major deal, Columbia Records. I didn't put it together. Rosewood, think a tree, stuff like that. Later on down the line, it turned out that it was a song that was dedicated to his parents. Because his mother's name is Rose. His father's name was Woody. So Rosewood. And I felt really honored. Because this is something this is a homage to your parents, the people that gave birth to you.
Yeah.
And you want somebody that's not in the family to actually bring your sentiments to your parents alive. It's like, wow, man. I mean, it's still to this day, it's something that really touches me as far as the confidence he had in me and the faith he had in me to bring it through. The breakup of the band was hard, or him firing me was difficult here, but I was able to handle it, so to speak, because he called me up one day and says, I think you forgot who the leader of the band is. I don't like your attitude, and I want my music back. Got anything to say? No. Nothing. And that was it. And a few years later, we hooked up again, you know, because couldn't last, you know, because we had some history, you know. And I guess the unfortunate thing of that whole thing is that three of the members are gone now.
Yeah.
3 out of the 5.
He had a terrible accident, didn't he?
He had a terrible accident where he was invited by Max Roach to come to the Vanguard. He was staying with his parents. A limo came to pick him up. Now this is kind of sketchy because I'm getting all this secondhand.
Yeah.
A limo picks him up, brings him to the Vanguard. He's going around the club. He's kind of loud, and the club ain't but that big. So they decide he needs to be sent home. He gave the limo driver a hard time coming. So the limo driver said, listen, I'm out of here. You take care of him, you know. So I had to get him a cab, but no one went with him. He went by himself. So I think he commandeered the cab to a location he wanted to go to. All right, what happened in between that, I really don't know because only Woody knows. Next thing you know, he's on a railroad track. Train comes in the station, goes over his arm. And he's in trauma. I think they amputate the arm. And a few more, I think, weeks of that, he finally succumbed. You know, and then Carter Jefferson was in Europe and Poland, and he had a problem with his liver or something like that. He took sick. The promoters thought he was high on drugs. There was no ambulance to put him in a cab to drive miles to the hospital, and they left him on the front step because they didn't want to be hooked up with this. You know what I'm saying? They didn't want to be party to a possible drug situation.
Right, in a foreign country and the whole
when
thing.
it was actually his liver or something. And so Carter died.
Yeah.
And then not too long ago, Clinton, who was the bass player, and it's all the original Woody Shaw band, he passed away. So it's like Victor and I are still holding up, you know, doing what we have to do individually. But that was one of the most incredible musical experiences. And to me, Woody, and I'll say this with no kind of censorship or any kind of limitation, Woody was probably the last major innovator on the trumpet. There are others who play now who are good, but as far as bringing a certain passion, because his eyesight, you know, a lot of times when someone has a certain kind of tragedy or a certain kind of situation, as a musician, it transfers into the music. And he being legally blind, which I know was something that really must have ate at him. Okay. I think came out of his passion, his music. And another thing that I have, of course, have no idea of knowing, but I think because his eyesight being so bad, he couldn't write tunes out a lot.
Yeah.
So he relied on the band members to bring tunes into the book. So he had a very democratic situation to the point that he would dog Carter to no end because Carter wouldn't put a tune into the book. He dogged him for about a year. And finally Carter brought this tune into the book. And we did a rehearsal at the Vanguard. And I don't know if you ever had this experience, but hearing a small group, and in the small group you can actually hear the orchestra.
Oh.
Okay, it's not, to me, a tune that comes to mind is Blue Rondo a la Turk by Dave Brubeck. and especially the middle part. You can hear an orchestra doing this. Carter brought this tune in called Rise from Atlantis. Had the same effect on me. I could hear the horns, I could hear the strings, I could hear the percussion, I hear the bell. I mean, it was an awesome tune. I said, well, Carter, this was well worth the wait. You know, if you're not contributing any music to this band, you know. And we have a couple of anecdotes with Woody that are priceless because we were asked to do a tribute to Mingus when Mingus passed away at Carnegie Hall. And of course, traditional thing when you pay homage to fallen soldier, you play his music. We at the rehearsal, we said, I ain't playing no Mingus music. That's all. I was saying, Woody, well, you know, my brain is going, man, if they don't want to hear my music, that's too bad. I'm playing my music. But I think that's not the point. We supposed to. So what happened, I had to think quick because I'm part of this band.
Yeah.
So whatever he does, I'm part of it.
Right.
So I said, well, I got to do something. I'd written this tune, which served both purposes. It helped to keep him doing his band music, yet still pay homage to Mingus. I'd written this tune called You Never Said You Had to Go. And he presented it in that context, as though I had written this music just for Mingus. I remember, my wife doesn't remember this, but I talked about it, and she was at the concert. She said she started crying because the sentiment of the tune, because Mingus died kind of suddenly. So the whole thing of you never said you had to go. So it was like, whew, man, we got that one, because at the rehearsal I was like, oh, I can't say that word right now. You know. And we got through it. We got through that. But, you know, more recently I've really been trying to just enjoy all the music.
Yeah.
Enjoy everything that's out there.
Tell me what a typical week is like for a musician
me?
like yourself in New York.
Watching Jerry Springer. No.
Yeah.
No, sometimes it's like that for a musician, you
Yeah.
know, watching TV. A good week is getting calls from different people. A good week is hooking up a session with somebody, getting called to go to London, getting called to go to Japan. I haven't written as much in recent years. I used to write music every day in high school. But what's happened now is that a lot of my old stuff is being recorded now.
Oh, wow.
Stuff that I wrote when I was 14,
Oh, my.
15 years old is now being recorded. I present this tune to a person. Oh, that's a great tune. You know, Vanessa Rubin. I produced her first two albums. And she did a song on mine I wrote when I was 15 years old. The lyrics were written much later, but the song itself was written when I was 15. I played it for her. She loved it. We got reviewed in a CD magazine, like the year-end review of the CDs for that year. The reviewer somehow thought that my tune was a standard.
Oh.
Because she said, well, if Vanessa recorded the standards, I Got a World in a String, Tenderly, Autumn, blah, blah. So Autumn, that's my song. It's the first recording of the song, but he thought it was a standard, which made me feel very good.
Yeah.
Because one thing that may get disagreement from people, but one thing that bothers me is that a lot of the cats now are not writing the new standards.
I've often wondered that. Where are they going to come from?
You know, we're still doing Stella by Starlight and, you know, all these tunes that, as great as they are, whether it's I Remember Clifford or whatever, the reason they wrote those tunes, Benny wrote I Remember Clifford, he didn't want to play what was done 30 years before that. You know, and it's good to have in the repertoire, but understanding the momentum. You know, in other music, people are constantly writing new songs in country and western music, and everybody's constantly writing new tunes, and new tunes that people can sing, they can really listen to. somehow jazz takes, again, this classical approach. Like, how many times you gonna do Beethoven's Ninth? How many times you gonna do Carmina Burana? How many times you gonna do Puccini aria from whatever? Okay, and the new music is usually an exercise in how many notes can I get in between two measures. Okay, how slick can I make the chord progression? And one thing that bothers me is the lack of engagement of the audience. Because one of the things that jazz does not share with the other more popular music of the day, namely rap, R&B, pop, whatever, is that audience participation is part and parcel of the presentation. It's what makes the whole presentation come alive, is actually the response of the audience to the music. In jazz, it's about a quiet policy and a polite applause between solos, you see, and that's it. And okay, we don't have a problem with that. But short of that, why can't you at least talk to the audience? Can't you like let them know what you're playing, or maybe who wrote it?
Right.
You see, doesn't happen. You know.
See, that comes, I think, your sensitivity to that also is partly due to the fact that you do write, you know, so that you feel like composers should be acknowledged when they get their pieces played, and
Yeah.
that's on target, you know.
Yeah,
And-
yeah.
and
I heard a concert where Buster Williams was playing, and he has this incredible piece called Christina. It's one of the most beautiful ballads you ever want to hear. But he was a sideman in this one group. They did it. You didn't know the name of the song, let alone know that Buster wrote it. And I think in a room full of people, it might be nice to know that it wasn't written by a piano player, it wasn't written by a horn player, but this beautiful, harmonically intricate song was written by the bass player who happens to be on stage right now. You know, how do we get to know our new composers? How do we get to know these guys? Okay, not just that Buster is a great bass player, but he's a great composer at the same time. And this bothers me in the music.
yeah.
You know, the lack of concern for the audience. And we don't have to become, you know, shucking and jiving and all kind of stuff, but just engage, to communicate. I remember Stefan Harris, who's one of the brightest young vibraphonist musicians out there. I remember going to his gig, and he was getting ready to announce the song, and he couldn't remember the tune. And he played it up. So everybody cracking up. Because he's getting ready to play the song, he don't even know the title of his own tune. And everybody's like cracking up in the club, which is part
Yeah.
of the whole thing. And then he said, I got this other tune I wrote, and you know something, I don't have a title for it. So I'll tell you what, if any of you have a good idea for a title, please let me know. Do you know people came up to the stage at the end of the gig, Stefan, I got the title for you, man. You know, but it was
Yeah.
great because you were engaging the audience.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't have to go jumping around. Everybody's not going like, hey, ho. You know, all right, you don't want that.
Yeah.
But still, in talking and communicating, because what happens is, this is my own feeling. What happens is that when you go to see a musician play, you come away with one or two things. Man, he was bad, man. He plays his butt off. Or he was kind of sad, you know. I wasn't really feeling him. To me, that's very one or two-dimensional at best. You don't know whether they have a sense of humor. You don't know whether they have kids, they're married, if they have any views. Which many times you see so many songs, like especially like say the during apartheid. You had all these songs, Johannesburg, Soweto, Tutu, okay, but no one talked about the inspiration of these songs. You know, it just became a tune that showed that they knew what was going on in the world,
Right.
but not so much they had any thought about it, just that it made them current. Why don't we hear some views that you have about South Africa, about apartheid? Okay, we don't do that. You know, now a lot of musicians did and still do talk, engage. That's what Cannonball did, Duke did, Louis Armstrong did, Barry Harris does. Okay, there are a lot of musicians who do talk. Frank Foster does. Okay, so it's not an indictment against all of us.
Yeah.
But there are enough of us that do not engage the audience that just makes it like one-dimensional.
It's good advice to heed.
Because you like to know something about the person.
Yeah.
Because see, again, a theory I have, that's why talk shows were invented, for the actors.
No.
Because you see an actor on stage or in a film, he's playing someone from the 18th century in one film, then he's playing someone from the 25th century in another film. He's a good guy in this film, he's a bad guy in that film. Okay, but you know nothing about the person.
Right.
So my own theory is that that's why the talk shows came in, because now you can see this actor that you see on screen on stage and get to know what he's like. Is he married? You know, what his feelings about the business? You know, what are some of the everyday struggles he's had? Okay, I think this dialogue helps to do that, but not enough of it.
Right.
Okay, and we have the opportunity even on stage to do that. And most of us don't take the opportunity. And it's also because the fact that it's primarily instrumental medium, it makes us less accessible. Because all the other genres are vocally driven.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I think we have to understand as jazz musicians, as opposed to, well, man, the rock musicians get this, and the pop musicians get this, and the R&B musicians, and how can rap and hip hop rise so much? Because they are vocally driven. And based on the stage presence and everything like that, jazz is not built around that. With the exceptions of the greats Ella, Sarah,
Right.
Joe Williams, Billy Eckstine, recent Diane Reeves, Cassandra Wilson, Kevin Mahogany. But that's a very small percentage of the entire jazz community, which are primarily saxophone players and guitarists and horn players, you know. So until we get to that point where we feel that we need to really reach out, jazz is always going to remain in a stereotypical, inaccessible mode. As long as we try to intellectualize the music to a point where it's above everybody's head.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, at the same point, you can play music for a little 5-year-old and they'll start dancing until we bring it off of the lofty stools that they're up and heights, because we're trying to offset the juke joints and all that the music thrived in. But where we go to Lincoln Center or Kennedy Center, the music you're playing in Kennedy Center was played in those juke joints.
Right.
So putting it behind a different building doesn't change the music. If it's elevated enough to be considered for the Kennedy Center, then it was always elevated, regardless of where they, because sometimes maybe that's all the place they had to play the music.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't condemn the music because you see it in a juke joint or see people boozing or drugs. Okay, which is the other thing again of equating jazz musicians with being drug users.
Yeah.
As though no other profession does that.
Right.
So no one can convince me that a person who works in the stock market is not on drugs. Okay, all that yelling and screaming and trying to keep with the stock market and changes. You gotta be on something. But they don't get condemned.
Listen, what's in the near future for you? We have to wrap up here, and I just
I have
wondered.
2 projects. I did a live at the Blue Note, which I'm very proud of.
All right.
Because I finally did a Henry Mancini tune that I talked about early on. I had never done Henry Mancini in any of my books. So I did Dreamsville from Peter Gunn and did more piano. Because I'm always was behind the scenes, get the saxophone player up there, trumpet player, but now I'm doing the front line. I have a studio project I did on my own with some great people on it that I'm trying to bring out independently. I'm working on a concept with the great singer Carmen Lundy to fashion a thing called the art of accompaniment. Okay, that hopefully we can take around different schools, high schools, colleges, to talk about the relationship between the pianist and the vocalist on all different kinds of levels, and the preparation that's needed from both. I've done some acting.
Okay.
I acted in a play, professional production of a play called Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill. And I play Lady Day's pianist,
Yeah.
Jimmy Powers. I had a few lines, but it was still a whole new kind of
Right.
experience. So that's something I may even check out a little more, you know. And I like to do some more scoring. I did a film for Danny Glover in '94 for Showtime. So that experience was something that has opened me up also. But the eclectic approach that I learned from being very young
Yeah.
is something I'm going to continue, not just as a solid jazz pianist, although I hate the word, I'll be honest, I hate the word jazz. I hate the word jazz because it so many things go with it that have connotations. Okay. But in lieu of a better term that comes up
Yeah.
down the pike, as a solid jazz musician,
Right.
but also to be involved in other sincere expressions, which may take me to Latin, Brazilian, hip hop, R&B. To me, if you're a serious musician about what you're trying to do, I don't care what you're playing, because we can communicate. Because we're doing something that a whole lot of people doing accounting and internet can't do. And that's really play notes, bring these notes together, and move people without words. Everybody can't do that,
Yeah.
or else everybody would be a musician.
Yeah.
You see, so that's what I want to do, and finally, to get my name to be something that people don't say, "Well, who's that?" Well, when's he coming up with something? No, I got something new out. I got something current out. I'm who I am, and
Yeah.
I want to finally, for 2001, set the record straight,
All right.
and not to be confused with Najee.
Oh, please.
That's happened. It hasn't
Oh,
happened
gee.
recently, but
Okay.
I went through a whole period of
Yeah.
that. Believe me, trust me. It was. We even took pictures.
Well,
Picture together.
really.
With T-shirt.
No kidding.
It says, "I'm not Najee." And his says, "I'm not Onaje." You know. So.
Well, I never had to do that with Thelonious Monk.
Oh yeah, but I
no
heard
one
people ask you
no
where
one
you
ever
get it
did
from.
that. They do. Well, listen, this has been really fascinating. I'm so glad we ran
Sir.
into each other
So long.
here, and
It's been a long time.
I
It's been
bet this is going to be a good year for you. And
I'm determined for it to be a good year.
All right.
You know, so I appreciate you having me.
all right, thanks so much.
Thank you.